Join me for a conversation with the game designer behind Rest in Pieces.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, if you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can head over to dicegeeks.com. But now, here is today's interview. My guest today is Emmy Award-nominated game designer and creative director for Imagining Games, Pete Petrusha. Pete, welcome to the show.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure. When did you fall in love with tabletop role-playing games?
When did I fall in love with tabletop role-playing games? So there's three parts I'll interject, right? One is when I first saw it and didn't know what it was. And I was a little kid. I was probably 10 or 12. I've told this story before, but I was in a hobby town, USA. We're in the Midwest. That was kind of more of like a model train and plane shop or whatever. But they had like 3 role-playing game books on a low-level shelf, and they were just sitting there. And being a kid, looking for toys because that's your job, I didn't know what they were because they were like with the other stuff, like as if they were a model or a toy or something, but they were just standing up. And the one that I gravitated towards was Shadowrun 2nd Edition, which is funny because if you're a 10 or 12-year-old, like there's literally advanced algebra equations for like grenades and like car collisions that I wouldn't know for years. Wow. But that was the one with the cover with the like there was an elven chick with the mohawk and she's got a wire in her head stuck to like an ATM looking thing. Yeah. And they're all around the corner. So I'd never seen anything cyberpunk. Like closest thing to anything like that would be anime. Yeah. But when I really fell in love with them, it was really more of a curiosity for a while. Would be when I got to play, it wasn't an immediate love. So it was like, oh, that was cool. It's a game. It'd be like playing a board game. You're like, oh, that's kind of cool. I used to hang out at a game store local to me, long gone now, but it was called City of Atlantis. And I was playing Magic the Gathering around freshman year in high school, like 8th grade, that kind of stuff. And I'd go there to buy my boosters and whatever. And I spent a lot of time there, like after school, weekends and stuff. And I'd make friends. We'd go to the other little local stores and play tournaments on Saturdays and stuff. And they'd have role-playing games also going on in the same, location. One of the tables might be us doing pick up and play Magic, and the other table right next to it could be a D&D group. So a couple times it'd be like, hey, so-and-so had to leave, the fighter left. This is very traditional D&D dungeon crawls. Literally, like, I don't know if our characters really needed names, because we were just roles. But I didn't really fall in love. I was a kid when I was even like, in recess in elementary school. I was always a kid playing pretend. I was my favorite characters from TV shows, whether it was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, or video game characters like Bubsy or something, like just random stuff. But when I got to play role-playing games about my freshman year with a couple of friends that would be like lifelong friends, who we played Dungeons and Dragons and we played like Vampire initially, where we got into character, like where I really felt an escape. Where I was like, as a freshman, you're dealing with identity. You want to be someone and respected as a different person than you are. It'd be like finding acting. Like I just got to literally be somebody else. Like a power fantasy, hero fantasy. You could do things you wouldn't do in everyday life because they hurt people, but you could do it because you have that freedom. So yeah, to fully answer the question, those are the times, the moments that really made an impact. But yeah, about freshman year is when I really fell in love. And that Magic the Gathering thing faded. And every day at the game store, I was playing role-playing games. And when we weren't there, we were talking about them. So
yeah, absolutely.
But that was when I had my group of people who were like up till 2 a.m., and I mean, I was really lucky because the core group of people that we played with, even though like I felt like I got initiated and they kept killing my character, like everyone was really, really deep into it. It was like before I only found out about like story game role playing very early on. So I find myself very lucky for that because I got a deep, rich role playing game experience very quickly. Where some people it takes them a while to find that, or they just have little moments of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand. I mean, and I know kind of exactly what you're talking about with kind of Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, right? Like, I mean, it was a weird. I mean, it would seem weird now to some people if you started playing in 2014 or something. That I would carry my character around. Right. And if my brother's friends invited us over to play D&D, I would just take my character and I would just plop him into the dungeon. Right. Because it didn't matter. Like nothing mattered. It was just like, I have the fighter. He's level 2 and here he is. And like, you just plop him in and, whether, it doesn't matter if his name is Torg or whatever it is, it just doesn't matter. And so that was, kind of an interesting experience there too. But I also feel kind of like you did that I was the kid on the playground. I was Voltron, right? Like I was, I was the pilot of a lion, right? Like I was just doing that all the time up until the point to where other, kids were looking at me like a little weird.
I try to remember, like I would recruit people, like all these kids, and we'd all be playing, and if it was like a glorious moment, there'd be like 5 to 8 different kids. We're all like on the jungle gym or the swings or whatever, but like we're pretending that like there's a bad guy who came, and like I'm in my head, I'm thinking Power Rangers right now, right? But it's like, Rita sends a monster, and then we got to get together, and like you said, Voltron style, we're like pretending to get beat up and fighting, but you're almost kind of directing it because you're a kid, and in your head, you're like, this is what it's supposed to be like. Yeah. And I'm sure now as a dad, like looking at other kids at that age play, that it in my head, it seemed like I was like making it happen, but it was probably a lot of kids doing their own thing, like all thinking that they were making it happen their way,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, like being a dad, because just probably just a month or two ago, my oldest, who is now 8, said he wanted to GM his younger brothers because I was taking care of the baby. And I was like, I can't play, because I've been role playing with him, in quotes, right? And I was like, I can't play. I'm taking care of the baby. And he's like, well, I will GM my 2 brothers. And so I'm sitting there listening to him. And I am like, just thinking like, oh my gosh, was that like me? Was that me like all those decades ago? Like, because he's just coming up with this stuff, he's just coming up with all kinds of crazy stuff. And like they were playing Star Wars, right? They were doing like the Star Wars thing, and he had them rolling. They would just roll a 6-sided die, and like he was just like, if they got a 4 or higher, they succeed. They succeeded. I don't even know where he came up with that really. And
that's incredible.
I know, it was so cool. And I was just like, was that me, back in the Dungeons and Dragons days or whatever, back in the 80s or whatever. And so it was so cool to see that. But it was just, but like, to carry on that point a little bit about the role play is just like, even though some of the earlier games may not have focused on that, I dove into role play head first, and my group of, buddies were the same way, right? Like we just dove in head first and we just role played the heck out of the stuff, right? Like, I had the one experience where I would carry a character around, to maybe some older people's houses or whatever.
Sure.
But like when it was me and the kid, a few of my friends who are my age, we just played the characters, right? Like rules, like we would just, well, we probably should roll something. So here's a 20-sided die or whatever, and we would just make it up, right? We would just make it up and we would just role play the character. And I think what you said too, that was really important is, you think about being, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old or whatever. It's just like the chance to like put on the skin of an adult, right? And do something and actually like be in control of that. It was just so much fun. And, just the idea of stepping onto the bridge of the Enterprise or whatever and being captain of a starship, right? It's just like, that was the coolest thing, right? Because
for better or worse too. Like when I said that, I felt like there was an initiation, and like sometimes I kept getting my character killed, but it was because I got to do things like try to create a rebellion try to be like that underground voice, bringing meetings together, trying to make people make change in their society, like stuff that you can't, I mean, you're a kid growing into a teenager, like, and you get in so much trouble, especially like if it was like anti-government or something, but in a game to be able to be those people. And now with what you brought up was I played all the Japanese role-playing games, like the Final Fantasies and the Chrono Triggers. So I had like this rich role-playing game history kind of as a base, like in the background as I'm learning about tabletop. But it's funny to think about, like, if my dad played, the generation before us, or maybe I don't know how old you are, but, somebody could have been looking at me like I had more of a base and an infrastructure because of video games that didn't exist in the 70s, like they did in the 80s and the 90s, So that's a funny thing to think about, too, as in hindsight of how, clearly in the 70s, D&D and such came out of the miniature wargaming movement, but they didn't have the story game, the narrative, these plot-driven sort of things to pull from. Where in my case, by the time I'm a teenager running games, I already been living vicariously through all these characters in video games and experiencing all these adventures and different characters and ideas. So I had all this stuff to pull from when I actually got into loving role-playing games like tabletop. Sometimes I guess I don't give that enough credit of like what that means about my generation of RPG player, right? Compared to the generation before me, who what they look for in a game or how they approached it from the get-go was different than me,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm 48, so I played for the first time in like 1982, 1983, kind of around there.
Yeah,
when I was like 9 years old or whatever, and of course it was Dungeons and Dragons because that was the only one we'd ever heard of at that point. But it quickly spiraled out of control with Marvel superheroes and Star Frontiers. And,
get the phase rip going on.
Yeah, everything. And then Star Trek, the old FASA system, all that
People
stuff.
love that. I'm really curious because I just didn't get into RPGs at the time yet, but God, people talk gloriously about the 80s and the Star Trek from FASA. Like people... one of the things I do a lot of convention booths, and we've been giving away a free product, which is Mythic D6. And Mythic D6 is basically like the Star Wars system from West End, like made into a generic game because when the license went up, the game disappeared. But a lot of people, that was their intro to RPGs, so they have this nostalgic love. So when I say all this, it's very comparable to FASA Star Trek. People who know it are like, oh my God, that was my game.
Yeah. And it's interesting you bring up the West End Star Wars system because from 87, right? Really, I have my first edition over here in the closet right here. But when I saw that in the store, seriously, I literally jumped and grabbed it because I was like, you could not imagine how into Star Wars I was right at the time. And what was interesting about that is that how you were mentioning the gateway is that at that time, Dungeons and Dragons was hard to get people into because the books are expensive. The rules were, no disrespect to, some people I've interviewed or anything. They were complex. That was kind of the era, right? The all games were kind of complex back then. And, it was hard to get people to play that. And I think too, we didn't have big, huge movies of Lord of the Rings out to give people kind of a fantasy base, right? They didn't even understand some of it in some kind of, in some cases or whatever. We had, the old Rankin Bass, animated, Hobbit, or we had Willow, I think the movie Willow or whatever, but we didn't have some of those things. And Star Wars, the West End games, right? I could say to somebody, do you want to play in the universe of Star Wars? Do you want to be Han Solo? And people are like, yeah, since I was 3, of course I do. And you're like, I could show you how to play the game in 15 minutes and we could make a character in about 10. And that was just an easy sell, right? That was just an easy sell. I didn't have to set up the universe. They already knew the universe, and teaching the rules was just as simple as showing them how to make a character and then telling them, if they were a little confused, you say, oh, see that 5 right there? You just roll 5 6-sided dice, or whatever it is. And so that was a great gateway for a lot of my friends that I would show them that Star Wars West End games and get them in to it. But, you did mention the fastest Star Trek. There is some kind of magic about that game, and I don't understand it. It's a little convoluted. It's a little, it's kind of the older style. But man, you go through character creation and you feel like you have been to Starfleet Academy and you have made a Starfleet officer, right? Like you know what ships they served on in the past, you can create all kinds of details about their history. Some of it you have to make up. Not that I would spend hours just doing that or anything, of course. But you just have a fully realized character with kind of a history behind it. And it was just so cool. Because that's what I think it fits the Star Wars universe so well, because, you're playing and you're like, now you're on, the Enterprise or something like that, but you can look back in your character's history and say, as a game master, you can drop something. Oh, do you remember this incident? And your character can, the player can be like, I was the chief security officer on the USS Potemkin, when that happened, and because you know that. And that was just so cool about that game. So yeah, just a rant on a game that's been dead for like 30 years or whatever, but it was really cool.
It just, like the conversation even just kind of reminds me as we touch base on like, when you find role-playing games, I'm sure you've talked at length, because this is one of those things that a lot of the designers would talk about, is that, especially if you played in the 80s, like, we look at the 80s movies for being what they were, so tropey, right? Like the Breakfast Club, all the John Hughes stuff, Stranger Things. I mean, but like it was the Satanic Panic. It was the time period where it was like the gamers before video games would even become cool, right? Like the gamers were the outcasts, were the nerds, were the dorks, were the, in a time when places like high school and colleges, they're always cliquey, right? They're always going to be cliquey. But I mean, when you and I sit here and talk and think about this, like, especially you being 48 and I'll be 42, like we've seen generational shifts, like multiple now, where like how much different it is today and like what role playing is, what being a nerd is, what having like hobbies are that are, not what other people tell you they should be. So it's interesting to have this conversation about the games too, that really strike a chord, because I often am always looking, when I'm selling games, you're trying to find the common ground of like, hey, do you like Doctor Who? There's a Doctor Who role-playing game. Oh, you like Harry Potter? These connections. But it's no surprise that Star Trek in the 80s and, West End or Star Wars in the 90s and the 80s potentially, like that these games would be the ones that could break those walls down. They could pierce through and grab someone who role-playing games would be too nerdy to do. But you grabbed something specific that was a little more pop culture acceptable, a little more, for a lot of people, family acceptable, as their, fathers or uncles were also into Star Wars or Star Trek. So they were okay to play that, maybe where D&D had weird connotations. So anyway, I'm just fascinated as we talk about this, thinking about that, if like these gateway games that grab pop culture and make people understand, oh, I can play Game of Thrones. I would love to do that, even if I don't care about Dungeons and Dragons otherwise. They were even more important then, like in a way that sounds obvious to say out loud, but like when you really think about being the people in those shoes, like you needed those games. What if there wasn't a Star Wars or a Star Trek RPG? You know what I mean? Like how many people would not have found role-playing games or would have ignored them is really what I'm trying to say here, right? For how long?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because as long as it was sword and sorcery, which just wasn't cool for a very long period of time, like you said, till Lord of the Rings almost made it cool. It was very niche. And for a lot of people, it was like an instantaneous yawn. Like, oh, I can't like magic and wizards and robes and, sword carrying guy. Like action movies are about guns, bro. And getting the, like culture changed so much and how that affected our hobby,
Yeah, absolutely. I think the geek has won in many respects, right? Like
the internet made it that if you don't have the internet with social media in particular, we're like, because we all overshare, like people need ways to identify and stand out. And we don't live in the culture anymore where it's like Harrison Arnold Schwarzenegger is the biggest action hero. So everything he puts out, everyone like eats up. Because one day you realize, oh, wow, there's all these great actors. And not everyone in the world cares with everything, every little thing that Jean-Claude Van Damme does. Like they used to when we didn't have access to all the information. You were just as smart and as knowledgeable as your town or your high school or whatever. Our world got so much bigger, and it allowed, right, that geekdom, nerddom, and individuality to be something to be praised, but also like we also saw that everyone has a hobby. Everyone has Facebook groups, like we all have our bubbles now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just
and I think too, especially for the kind of the generation, a bit younger than me and maybe even then a bit younger than you that are in their kind of their mid 30s now, right? That we underestimated, say, the popularity of Power Rangers and Pokemon, right?
Yeah.
Pokemon. The popularity of that was so, it was so popular, right? Like unbelievably popular and
total phenomenon. It's Harry Potter, Pokemon. Like these are like you said, like a whole generation grew up on Pokemon, from the cards to the Game Boy games to the Switch games to the to the more cards to the movies to 15 20 years of just I've been in absorbing everything Pokemon. And like you said, I missed that wave, you missed that wave, but there are kids, and that made a whole group of people like, oh well, if anime is cool, then why would role-playing games be so weird? Like you said, it broadened interests.
Yeah, absolutely. And then too, you had brought up the video games too. And of course, that generation is playing Final Fantasy. Some of the huge games were the Final Fantasy games and some of the Zelda games and different things that have come out over the years. And what I find always interesting about that, which I didn't realize about video games until I started interviewing some of the old people, I shouldn't say old, that was disrespectful, but some of the guys who worked at TSR, kind of back in the day in the 80s. They went on to make video games in the 90s. And so they really influenced video games. So it's like, I remember, in the early 90s playing, I can't remember the name of the video game, but going, man, this feels like Dungeons and Dragons. Well, it was like probably designed by a guy who worked on Dungeons and Dragons, because that's just the way it was. Or it was a game that came out of Japan, but they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? They were influenced by Dungeons and Dragons themselves. So it's just really interesting how, I think I would have thought it was like computer role-playing games versus tabletop role-playing games when in a lot of the cases you will find it's a lot of the same people who work on both of those things. And I didn't really put that together. And, until, like I said, I started interviewing people like Mike Bro or Bill Slavacek or, some of these other people, right? Bill Slavacek wrote the source book for the West End Star Wars game, all three, Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. He was in charge of the whole thing, and now he's lead writer for Elder Scrolls Online. Mike Bro worked on all of those. Now he's worked on Call of Duty and Far Cry and all this stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just I should have put that together, but I just didn't even put that together. So we see this role playing games; they're just all interconnected and they're all related. And I think it is fascinating just to see that, even if, like, we were saying about, Pokemon or Harry Potter, like we should mention, right, that even if you haven't even heard of tabletop role-playing game, if you can imagine collecting a little animal in a sphere, or imagine a wizard university with little kids who are wizards. You're like 2 seconds away from playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Or from playing Pokemon, the role-playing game, or playing Harry Potter, the role-playing game, or playing something like that in your D&D or whatever game you're playing at the time, which, is a common thing, especially as people either don't have the money or know of other game systems, the variety out there, which is less common today than it used to be. Mm-hmm. That's what we all did, right? Like whatever games we were playing, we just tailored them for whatever new fandom we had, right? Like,
absolutely. I mean, I remember
you can do vampires in Shadowrun, or you can do, clowns and vampire. And they wouldn't necessarily ever be good fits or whatever. And now in hindsight, I would never do these things, but like we had no problem doing it. And if you're having fun, I mean, you're not doing it wrong. I mean, the whole point is entertainment. So
yeah. I mean, I remember using some of the basic D&D rules to play like a Highlander game with my friends, right? Because there was no such thing, of course, back in the day. Now I think one's coming out, which is awesome,
right?
But
I remember we did Fallout, right? Like, and now clearly there are Fallout RPGs, but like, in the 90s there wasn't, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Mad Max as well. I mean, that really started my game design in the 90s was when I wanted to play a Mad Max game. I told my group, "Hey, do you guys want to play like a Mad Max game?" Everybody's like, "Yeah." And I was like, well, I need some rules. And so, I mean, what do you think I did? I mean, I took the D6 rules from Star Wars and, and of course now I was able to use the open D6 license and actually, put out the game. Right. So, using the D6 system because, it's there and it's available and it's awesome and you can just play it and it's very adaptable as well. But kind of speaking of that, we've been kind of down nostalgia lane for a while talking about cultural phenomenons and stuff. But and I was just talking about some rules and stuff there. You are Annie nominated for best rules, and so I would be remiss if we did not talk about game design and rules.
I wish people could see me right now because I'm just glowing, right? When somebody says it out loud, you're just
Annie award nominated. So there you go.
And that's only because we don't know yet. There's two chances for me to win. It could be silver or gold. Either way, I can say I am a Annie award winning.
Yeah.
But I'm totally, if not, Annie nominated is everything, right? The judges picked my little game, Rest in Pieces, out of tons and tons and tons of games. It just keeps growing every year as all these new titles keep getting crowdfunded and there's more games coming into distribution and game stores than ever before. So I'll take it.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll keep saying it, but you're right. We don't know right now, but this will air. You will have most likely, I would say, have won an Annie award, but hopefully I won't jinx it or anything. But anyway, why don't you then? So you're playing games, and you said you were playing Magic, and that kind of went away, and you were just playing tabletop role playing games. What then makes you want to make the leap into game design?
Yeah, I was dumb first, and I don't mean that it's gonna be funny how I continues on. Is that I was dumb because in the 90s, when I was going to high school, the internet came out of the scene and there was all these .coms that became huge business. Like, I mean, look at Amazon today, but there was a ton, whether it was like, I don't know, pets.com or whatever. There was just something for everything. So, I had googly eyes for a lot more money than role-playing games. Mm-hmm. But it would be years and years and years later that my entrepreneurial spirits would eventually find something more reasonable and rational given what impacted my life, what was important to me, and where I should give back for the value that I gained. And that eventually became tabletop role-playing games. It's funny to look back on your youth in the way of, like, my dad would always be like, couldn't you just do something like with video games or something? Because you just love games. So couldn't you like work on games or something? But it was always video games, right? Because like that's what that generation understood. All of the parental figures or role models in my life were like, video games. And in my head as a teen growing into a young man, college age and so on, was that there wasn't much money in tabletop role-playing games. And that was apparent from the get-go. So, of course, I was always dreaming bigger. But returning to your question is that eventually you find yourself in your 30s, comfortable, college behind you, settling down, cush job that's just like, where you can see the bottleneck coming, because you can see, okay, that's about as far as I'm going to get without working really hard. Working really hard. I've had moments in my years where I've been, a restaurant manager. I've had, times where I've been pushing carts and, waiting tables. I've just kind of seen the typical spectrum of being, now I do a lot of office work, but the point is that there is a level of dedication required the higher up you want to go in any hierarchy, which usually leads to something like salary, working holidays and weekends, being unpaid for these things, having a lot more responsibility and stress, maybe having to be the first one to enter the door, the office in the morning, or the last one to leave, where you start, maybe the games designer in me, finding that like, hey, or I can get paid 80% as well, get up to this part and just be the guy who shows up and gets all the amenities and, whatever. And be kind of happy with that, knowing that, what else is required, and having this work-life balance thing that, is more important to people of today than maybe when I was a little kid. So yeah, in my 30s, I was there, right? And I was thinking about, well, I got some space in my life. What would I like to put in it? And I was finding myself returning to, role-playing games and looking introspectively at what I was into and what impacted me. I was like, I'd like to make something to kind of give back to role-playing games. And I think you could probably totally understand and appreciate that, right? Like, I'm sure there's part of you that feels the same way. Am I right in that?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
I didn't get back into it in a place where I needed the money, or I needed this, even if, it didn't have to be successful, it was just about kind of like seeing it through, trying to make something cool. And what leads to this whole best rules side of things is I like to innovate. So my first game was Dreamchaser, a game of Destiny. And really there's a handful of sort of tenets to it. Like, I eventually came on this game concept that was like, the promise of role-playing games is you can do whatever you want, be whoever you want. And then we generally, being the flag bearer, we put them in a D&D group. We tell them what else is in the party. We kind of help them min-max their character, because what's the point of having a dwarven barbarian or, whatever it is. And then we sit them in a party going after whatever the group's doing. And what I heard there was compromise, compromise, compromise. We didn't actually fulfill anything we sold that person on. You could be whatever you want to be, do whatever you want to do. So a Dreamchaser set out from the get-go of being like, it's a game where the players create a goal for the game. Instead of trying to sell you a setting, the concept was that the most important thing that happens at the table is us coming together for a common goal, because that's really the core of what we're going to do. And if we start with the setting, a lot of times it's imprecise because the game master doesn't know what to do with the setting once you get a group of characters that are all over the place, which is usually what happens with player characters. So anyway, the long story short of it was that it was a game that kind of tried to do that, a game where the players never had to open a book. They could just be like walked through by the game master, making their character using words they understand, by describing the kind of character they want. The description would give mechanical things that the rules would benefit them or help reinforce the stuff they wanted. They all get to have a moment of like, what is a spotlight moment they're hoping for in this game concept that they had, like lift Thor's hammer or bring Firefly Black back to TV, the sort of goal of what their story was. And at the same point, it was something that the players then got all this buy-in, made characters with the goal in mind, and then hand to a game master and say, run me this game. So that a game master then didn't have to figure out what they want, know how long they want to play, what are they getting at. Just all this stuff was kind of answered. So that game was all about functionality, like, and kind of restoring that promise, like letting people play whatever they want to play, do whatever they want to do in a role-playing game, and hopefully reinforce that experience. And then we could do whatever Matt's favorite game is, whether it's like Capture the Fairy Queen or Speak to a Talking Cat, or whatever Pete wants to do, like, ask the moon for a favor, or bring someone back from hell. But yeah, and then that was kind of where I started, was that I'm sure you, again, a game designer, we're both, I kind of keep lists. I keep a lot of lists. So I'm always game concept on one list, mechanic ideas on another list. And I'm always moving stuff around on these lists. Sometimes you tinker on something. Sometimes you don't ever touch something. And then as the inspiration kind of grabs you, you work on things, and some things eventually click. But I think it's very short-sighted for most people to grab whatever's their first one thing and run with it, right? Like it's always a matter of, like, true excellent brainstorming is just sitting there with no other goal in mind, just brainstorming. I'm going to sit here for 20 minutes and I'm just going to write every thing on my mind that meets the criteria. I'm not going to vet it. I'm not going to score it. I'm not going to try to make it work in my head. I'm just writing down ideas. And then from there, we can go to a vetting process and a matching process, these kind of things. But I think a lot of people, and maybe it's school that does it to us, like we're like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's run with that.
Yeah.
But, it's short-sighted. Like have 8 good ideas and then try to see which one's the best instead of running with the first one and trying to make it a square peg fit in a round hole,
Yeah.
So my 30s, comfort, functionality, wanted to give back. That's really where I got to this place of wanting to really, truly like make stuff. And part of that dedication too is that like role-playing games, like when I look back on my life, I had these wonderful friendships that were like lifelong that a lot of people don't have, I had like levels of confidence, these wonderful memories of like being a captivating storyteller and like these great games that we talked about for years and years and years and years that were like homebrews and things that I made up. And that's a really powerful thing that role-playing games have. It's like the memories they help you create and the feelings they give you, how they empower you, especially as a kid or a teenager going into life. Yeah. And as well as I do, like sometimes you want to write in a resume, like all the stuff I learned from role-playing games, like multitasking, task management, delegation, setting a vision, goal setting,
management, team management.
Team management, communications, HR, what it goes, scheduling and trying to deal with problematic players,
scheduling, logistics. Yeah.
Hiring and firing.
Yeah. No, I absolutely understand. Pretty much everything you're saying, because seriously, like, I don't know, it'll happen every, I don't know, maybe every few months or so, maybe every 6 months or something. I'll get a Facebook message or a text from like an old friend that I haven't talked to maybe in a few years or something like that. And they'll just say something like, do you remember that time when you ran that game and my character did whatever? Yeah. And I'll be like, yeah. And they're like, that was the coolest thing, thank you for running that game. And I'm like, that was like 22 years ago, or whatever, but like, it just lives on, and it's just like, and like, as soon as they mention it, right, it's just alive in my mind again or something. And it's just like, well, yeah, I remember that. It was like we actually lived it, right? It was a memory we share. It's a story that we have together. Yeah. So I totally
ownership, the uniqueness, right? That it's something that only your table will truly ever understand.
Yep.
As anyone who's ever shared a game or story knows, right? As they lay the eyes glass over and you're like, yeah, it was much cooler if you were there.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But usually that's the problem. I mean, we all have it, so I'm not making fun of anybody, but
no, yeah, exactly.
That's like, yeah.
Usually I still tell one. Yeah. And I'm like, I know better. I do. They often fall flat,
Yeah, because I'll go to cons and I'll be like, oh, what's your last game or something? I'll be like, why did I ask that? Because then, I'll get this big story. But then like an hour later, I find myself trapping somebody, telling them all about my game. So, I mean, it's just a disease we all have. I don't know. But, and then of course, but the thing is too, right? You can always steal ideas, right? Because somebody will say something and it'll be like, oh yeah, it was like, post-apocalyptic, North America, and there was a beaver the size of Godzilla. A guy told me that, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I don't know when I'm going to use that, but I'm stealing that one. I need that. I need a beaver the size of Godzilla because that's what I need. But sorry, getting off track again.
No, and the shared memories is such a point that doesn't get talked about enough. We just take it for granted.
Yeah,
but. I had a friend pass away that we have all these it's funny how I can like talk about him as a player and then the characters that he had, like what it brought to the group dynamic. And then when that person passes away, this element of these shared memories that aren't like recorded somewhere, we can't like retell it to people. Like if there was a moment, like if I was running a game and everyone fell asleep, and like you were the only player that stayed up with me for 2 more hours. We did all this awesome stuff, or maybe your character died, like there was self-sacrifice or something. Then everyone wakes up in the morning and they're like, "What happened?" And then we're like talking about it. If one of us disappears one day, like there's a moment where you go, now I'm the only one who holds this. It's like I need to go make hieroglyphics or something, right, to keep the memory alive. And it's a very powerful thing because like living vicariously through our characters is something that we do in video games all the time. But I think there's something lost to when we're not actually imagining ourselves. I mean, there's a level of ownership that's detached because we're looking at the character or the avatar, but it's not us. Yeah. And there's something about, I think naturally when you're imagining in your mind's eye, there's the occasional moments, if not, that it's like you're the one in the armor, right? Or you see your friends in the armor or whatever, it seems like there's one more layer of intimacy that's there that's like lost when we have something else to stare at.
Yeah, and that's interesting too because I have a similar story. Just last year, a friend of mine passed away, and it was interesting. I told the story on the podcast a number of times because it was like we were like in 8th grade or something. I had no idea who he was. It was like first day of a study hall. I didn't know the kid. I didn't know anything. It was the first day of a study hall, and I'm sitting there getting out, probably some math book or something. Actually I was probably getting out my D&D character and going to do something on it. But like, I see him, he pulls like a Ravenloft book out of his backpack. I just happened to look up and see him pull a Ravenloft book out of his backpack. I just stood up in the study hall, walked over to him and said, "Do you play Dungeons and Dragons?" And he was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Do you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "We've got to play," because nobody, hardly anybody was playing back then. And, or at least I didn't know people who were playing. I think older kids might've been playing. And it was just like, we've got to play. And then it was like, we just started talking about role-playing games. And then it was like, oh, my name's Matt. And he's like, "Oh, my name's Ray." Like, we just that didn't even matter. Right. We were just into role-playing games. And so we played. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you, right? There are so many campaigns, so many D&D characters, so many Star Trek characters, so many Star Wars characters, different thing, a Shadowrun, some other stuff. We never really got to play Shadowrun too well. We always made the characters and it took us like a week and we could never really get to do that. The Palladium games. We tried to play the Palladium games so much, but like, there are stories, right? There was a Klingon campaign where he was a Klingon admiral and he had this fleet of ships and he just raced across the galaxy and it was glorious, right? Like, it was just amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I know I'm thinking about that and I'm just like, oh man, I'm the only person who holds those memories now.
It takes two or more.
Yeah. Because I was talking to like his brothers and stuff at the funeral and everything. And
I don't know what it is. Maybe because there's nothing bad about them. Like, they're innocent memories. Yeah. Like there's no way of looking back on them for the most part and remembering bad parts that they only bring a smile to your face, right? They only give you incredible joy.
Absolutely.
I don't know what it is necessarily, but
because I think you're right. And it's more of a connection than sharing movies or TV shows, even because we have the shared story. Right. But yeah, it's not like looking back on my high school days and saying, "Oh, we got in so much trouble in school," or whatever. It's not it's not like that. Right. It's just like there was something else. Right. Like I got to see him in all these different roles, like noble roles, right? Like and it's powerful. I don't know. It's powerful stuff. So,
and I wonder, maybe you hit it on the head. Maybe it's that you get to see people for more than they get to be in everyday life.
Yeah.
I mean, because sometimes it's weird being a character, like a player. Like, I have to remind myself, when there's new people or if you're, because you've been doing it for so long, you just can forget. But even when you're playing with strangers or new groups, sometimes you can see like the hesitancy of people to be vulnerable, to put themselves out there, or, whether it's a voice or an accent they don't know if they should do or, but when you really get to play with people for, at least a little while, you get to see them for all the people they want to be or all the things they would like to be or the actions they would take if they were cooler, smarter, more risk takers, but you kind of get to, I don't know, maybe see more sides to a person. I don't know. Absolutely. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting too, that my friend, he was actually severely physically disabled and, he couldn't run, right. He could walk a little bit when we were in, junior high and high school, but then he had to be in a wheelchair. And he never ran in his life. But like, I was just trying to think maybe in some little part, some of those games, right, let him be something more than he was able to be here.
Yeah.
That for those hours we stayed up until 3 a.m. playing games, that it was just like, he could actually be more of himself. Right.
Yeah.
Even though he was pretending to be, Admiral Karatak or whoever it was or whatever.
Yeah. Or you got to, I hate to say more of himself, right? It's more of like, he got to be more, he got to try more. Like he, if there was things that he didn't get to, like experience as much, he had another outlet, right? There's more things where he got to. The weird thing when you said this that really made me feel like maybe we touched on something was that like, there is like a love in role-playing games, a camaraderie that players have together. But like, it's very special that a game master and that player could have together created a moment of game where, if that person wanted to run, well, just like in a movie when you see like, Forrest run and like the ankle bracelets break off or whatever, it's one thing to watch it. It's another thing to know that your friend in real life maybe wants these things and would like to do these things in a game, and then to help them have that happen because you care about them as a person and the game. And, it's, what I mean? It's like it's really a loving, endearing thing. When you have these moments of character spotlight that you're both driven to because you both really like each other, you appreciate each other, it's like the moments where you have these best friend moments because you two can make these things happen that, otherwise in real life are either impossible or incredibly difficult, right? Can't just give you $1 million. But if you were really poor, had no food, we could role play what it'd be like if you found $1 million, if you won it, and what you would do with it. And while we often talk about the power of fantasy, of murder hobos in D&D, the power of role playing is also that, where we can just go overboard, just embellishing on how great would it be if you got to make a movie and it was the #1 box office draw next week, like we could have that reverse thing of like, and then this would happen and that would happen. So-and-so would call and, and that's a powerful thing, if nothing else, of visualizing success, right? Like feeling like you're experiencing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now we got a far afield again from talking about your game designing in that. So you had mentioned your first game, Dreamchaser, and it sounded very interesting that you could just mention something and there's a mechanic to it. And I wanted to follow up on that just a little bit. So if we were sitting down to play and I can say like anything and then you have a mechanic or something like that for them?
So when you make your character, like you're going to have kind of like Powered by the Apocalypse games, there's tags. So there's just descriptors, right? But you're going to make them up. There's no list. I mean, there are lists, but they're examples really. Like maybe you're saying that, the character I have, I think that they're wiry. Maybe I think that they're relentless. Maybe I think that the person has really good taste in shoes. And when I roll in the game, and for reasons that the dice fail me, I can use these 3 reasons to explain why I would be better suited in this situation than just the average Joe who doesn't have these 3 things, like a good taste in shoes or that they're wiry. So at character creation, you're creating the character, but then a lot of the stuff on the sheet is like you are using it to defend why your character should be better at stuff, right? One of the tenets, so that's just the tags. They just allow you to reroll when you can explain yourself, because great RPG moments usually have good synergy between a player and a game master. And a lot of that comes from just being descriptive. Like if we're both being descriptive, we're both kind of getting immersed because we're thinking about it and we're putting in the forefront. And a lot of times that's creating better gameplay. If nothing else, it's also better for the other players because they get more details. They understand what's going on. We learn more about your character. Yeah. But another thing in Dreamchaser is that everything a player does action-wise that needs a roll is filtered through one of three strategies or more, starts with three strategies. You get to say, what are the three ways you try to approach all of your problems? I mean, and it could be like one of the fun things. It could be like, I'm a mooch, right? Like I mooch my way through my problems. So sometimes it's fun because things that are never, ever mechanically like propped up as something we should reinforce. Like you can play dastardly characters. I've had people who are like, they get beat up, but they have to describe how they would get beat up in a process to roll this successfully. Having a moon-based laser. So, I mean, this is where we're getting crazy. But instead of, playing Savage Worlds or something where everybody's got fight, stealth, and marksmanship and diplomacy or something, maybe you have scrapbooking, sous chef, and high heel shoes. But like now it's very funny how you're going to either reasonably use these things or imaginatively use these things in situations. But like in real life, we have wheelhouses. We have ways we approach our problems. If you're an engineer, like a lot of people will be like, dude, well, he's an engineer. That's why he tries to do it this way. So kind of in that Maslow's like hierarchy of needs, this is kind of like that sort of, it's not the hierarchy of needs, but it's the, these are your hammers to hammer in the nail. And it's really up to you to describe how you would try to do things that maybe aren't in your wheelhouse when these are the three ways you try to solve your problems, which creates interesting gameplay, very unique characters. And sometimes it's just ridiculously hilarious because, people are like grasping at straws to make sense of things.
Yeah. So I could say something like telepathic dog, and that could be a character.
Yeah. So strategies aren't the first thing that happens. So by that point, we've talked about like, what's the goal of the game? Like, what's the goal of our story, whether or not we'll succeed? Like we said, if we're bringing Firefly back for more TV or making a Firefly movie, because I've had these games at least 2 or 3 times of, between the two of those kind of concepts. One time they did a reality show by the end and they were like on a spaceship that looked like Serenity, the Serenity ship or whatever. And they're funny. I've had someone literally play, I can't think of the guy's name, but the dumb lug character, the hard ass, I can't think of his name right now, but
in Firefly?
Yeah.
Jane.
Yeah, I've literally had someone play the actor that's Jane, who's like thought that they were Jane at this point and like was jumping up and down at like Fox Studios, like on the table in the boardroom, like player characters doing that, like and being that person in that situation. But those are some of the basic ideas of that. Was that literally once the players pitch out different ideas of what they want the game about, and then they vote and they say, this is the game we're going to make. And they make characters with the goal in mind. They all kind of pop in at least one sort of, we call them milestones, but they become like chapter goals in telling the story. These moments, we're going to have these awesome character spotlights we're working towards. And then I was trying to think, then they talk about like, what are my strategies for trying to be this person that I already talked about, like what my role is. So it works out better that we don't start there. Because clearly you could, but it'd just be more gonzo, right? Order of operations, as you know, as a game designer, is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. Well, that's fascinating. Well, I've already had you on here like an hour or so. We haven't even talked about your Any Award nominated game. So please tell us about nominated
I have this effect on people. So it's not you, it's me.
Oh, okay.
So Rest in Pieces, again, the recurring theme here is kind of like functionality and innovation. I was at PAX Unplugged, and I used to run conventions for the Indie Game Developer Network, a big, basically organization of independent game designers collectively pooling their resources so that we get booths at Gen Con and other conventions. And we do a sponsorship for marginalized designers and, the award show and stuff, just a bunch of great stuff that's really neat. I used to run the conventions for them. And we were at PAX Unplugged 2017 when the first year it opened. And I wasn't convention coordinator at the time, but I was there working the booth. And we had tables with just a bunch of books laid out everywhere. Way too many, honestly. It was overwhelming, especially for a younger audience that was still kind of casually board gamey, role-playing games. And we had enough people come to the table and literally say, oh, these are games? oh, these are books that are games. What kind of D&D is this? And at that convention, I realized I'm trying to sell you a role-playing game, which is a book. And you were looking, this is the new audience, right? This is the audience at the time that we're like, okay, this is like Critical Role audience. This is the new, we've been seeing these streams and we thought maybe we'd try it sometime. They wanted a box. They wanted a game that they could go play with their friends in the hallway right now, like today. Like they saw books as like a barrier. It was like, oh, yeah, well, I'm going to pay a bunch of money. And when am I going to use that? Like 6 months from now, So Rest in Pieces, built off of the Epidia Ravichol's Dread, the original Jenga Tower horror RPG, really critically acclaimed. I think it came out in 2006 or 2008. One of my game design goals was I wanted to innovate on it if nobody else did. And I set out kind of on a journey eventually to like look into it. And this moment at PAX Unplugged and these needs kind of came together and mashed up over time with this one game design goal I had of basically innovating on the Jenga Tower. Originally, Rest in Pieces was just a card deck. So it was a card deck and a Jenga Tower, 2-color Jenga Tower. It started with 3, but that doesn't matter. So I was like, games deceptively tell people can be on cards. And I mean, they could literally like Magic the Gathering. Like it could take you an hour to learn how to play the game in a folded up, paper rule set, right? Mm-hmm. Folded 64 times. But people see cards and they go, oh, it's fast. Like I can do that. So I was like, if I put the rules on cards and if I tried to make more of the rules in front of the players, so it was like there when they needed them, as they needed them, people would, the presumption would be that this is fast. And that's what I need, is I need the psychology of the consumer to be like, oh, and the mechanic, I don't need to have my own dice. Like literally in this box, they have this tower that I can touch and move the blocks, and that's what I need. So it needed to be like self-contained, don't need to print out anything. For a long time, the rules of the game were like on 8 cards. But anyway, I could go on and on. So there was a few different iterations of like conceptually what was the skinning of the game. So originally there's a Coldplay song called Death and All His Friends. And I'd been kind of, like I said, it was on this checklist of something that was just interesting to me was, who are the people Death didn't kill? Why? Is it lonely being Death? You see all the memes, right? Like, if you were the eternal Grim Reaper and you were the one who literally came and took everyone's souls one by one. Like, were there moments where you were vulnerable? so I had this cool concept where I was kind of coming up with ideas of like, who were like these 5 or 6 different characters, like that Death didn't kill. And instead you kind of had to deal with Death of being like almost kind of a problem in your life because Death really like, overly enjoys your company, really likes you, tries to help you, but always makes things worse. But I was doing a focus group on it at Metatopia Game Design Festival, which is fantastic. It's the best place to play test anything. And I had a couple awesome people, Rob Donahue, who helped design Fate, and James D'Amato was there, and they were toying around with like, what about if like Death was just a shitty roommate? And we were like laughing, and I was like, that's not at all what I thought or what I came up with or what we were focused grouping, but we just kind of went somewhere. And I was like, okay, like, look at this. Like everyone's really into this and it's really funny, but I didn't know if that was like a conception, like something, the game I need to make. Like, is it the game that I can, Tony Robbins says, right? Like when people are like, hey, how can you be good at speaking about something? And he's like, I never talk about anything that I'm not passionate about. And you should never talk about something that you're not passionate about because it shows. So I was like, I can't make a game that sounds good like it would sell just because. Like that's it's got to be a game where it sings for me to make, right? Like where I'm like, oh yeah, this is like a part of me that I'm putting in this game. So anyway, eventually became a game where you play deadbeat roommates that live with the Grim Reaper in a cramped studio apartment. It's very slacker sitcom-esque of a game. It plays with a 2-color Jenga tower. When you go to do things in the game, you pull blocks from the tower. But unlike games like Dread, you can only touch one block unless you can use some of your abilities to get more touches on the tower. The two colors, the dark blocks, are when you're being selfish. The light blocks are when you're thinking about someone other than yourself, because deadbeat roommates aren't necessarily evil. They might be, but they're just being selfish often. So when the tower collapses, it helps pace the game to play like in an hour, because so many times, people are like, I don't got time to role play. What about this game? You can make characters, and literally, if you just want to draw cards to make your character, because the cards, for the most part, just describe your character. They literally place around a character card that's dry erase, telling me like your dead end job, your odd hobby, your deadly object, the stuff that bothers you about your roommate to your left and your roommate to your right. What's my pipe dream? A little goal I have in life. So it really became a really awesome, stupid, funny pick up and play game. That's a role playing game experience. They can play in an hour. That's tactile, that innovates on dread. Literally nothing to print out. And people are kind of talking about it now like it's like Cards Against Humanity, the role-playing game. Because players almost kind of one-up each other, doing more and more horrible things until the tower comes crumbling down and something really, really bad happens to a player. And then we all add to it to make sure that it's horrible. It's very much like the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy or the regular show, Rick and Morty. These are the kinds of the tone and the humor, right? It's mature themes for immature play.
Well, it sounds fantastic, and certainly obviously now award nominated. So
it's all the validation in the world, especially like when some of my friends are like, hey, I remember Pete when like 3 or 4 years ago, you're like, you set out to innovate on dread, and like it was known, Mm-hmm. So then when you get a set of elected judges who see all the games in the premier RPG awards, them to be like, hey, this game's up for best rules. Like we think this should be up for best rules. I mean, like there's no better validation, to say, hey, I innovated enough that they thought and saw, it just, and as a game designer, like when you get best rules, it's like, I did that part. A lot of times you're like, I've gotten an indie groundbreaker award for like best art. And yeah, it's awesome, the art direction that I did, but I didn't draw anything, So it's so cool to be seen and to feel like accomplished, and for all the eyes it's going to bring to the game, especially because like it's one of those games where, like I said, it's going to be players will play this game. Game masters will table it. It won't be on a shelf, right? You will use this. And it comes with a tower. It's like $40. There's a bunch of cool expansion decks. If you don't want to live with death, you can live with like the 80s Dungeon Master from the cartoon who retired to South America and loves pro wrestling. Cthulhu's there. The Rick from like Rick and Morty. So these awesome things for everybody. So
yeah, that's awesome. Well, Pete, I could probably keep talking to you for like 3 more hours, but I need to let you go here and respect your time. Well, why don't you just tell us, where can people find Rest in Pieces and some of the other games? Where can they learn more about you?
Okay. Yes. So my company is called Imagining Games. You can go to imagininggames.com. You can find, we have a great web store that, you get free shipping and stuff if you buy any 2 things or a bundle. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. All the links are there. Make it easier for you. We'll be at Gen Con. I don't know if 3063 if this airs, but you might find me at Grand Con over in Grand Rapids in September, or Gamehole Con Madison back in October. So hope to see you. Come by, say hi. I'm really nice, obviously, and I'd love to run you a game. So.
Well, that is awesome. And I will be sure to put the link to your website and to some of your social media in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now could head over there and check those links out. And I would encourage you to do so. Well, Pete, it was just a total blast talking to you. I mean, when episodes run like this, it just means that I'll have to have you back on sometime again. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for letting the conversation go to these places. I really appreciate having a conversation like this where, the two of us, obviously we have a lot of similar passions and a lot of similar experiences even. Mm-hmm. And it's neat to go further than just the face level, like across the aisle. Like it's nice to kind of get to know somebody. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Pete today. Please head over to dicegeeks.com, check out the show notes for this episode, and follow the links there so you can learn more about Pete and his amazing, amazing games. All right. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get some PDFs that will help you in your gaming. You will also get an email update from me every Friday letting you know what is going on in the wild, wild world of Dice Geeks. All right, now, guys, I really appreciate you listening to the show. If you want to support the show in some way, you can do so by liking, rating, reviewing, subscribing. I would really appreciate that. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming!